Paradoxes have been a central part of philosophical thinking for centuries and are always ready to challenge our interpretation of otherwise simple situations, turning what we might think to be true on its head and presenting us with profitably plausible situations that are in fact just as profitably impossible. Paradox number 1 is the grandfather paradox, one I'm sure you've already heard about. All of us know that if you ever travel back in time, you should definitely not kill your own grandfather, lest you create some kind of temporal paradox/rift in the space-time continuum. This problem, known as the grandfather paradox, presents the main problem of time travel. If you go back and present yourself from being born, how would you have ever been able to go back in time in the first place? Paradox number 2. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise is one of a number of theoretical discussions of movement put forward by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea in the 5th century BCE. It begins with the great hero Achilles challenging a tortoise to a foot race. To keep things fair, he agrees to give the tortoise a head start of 500 meters. When the race begins, Achilles, unsurprisingly, starts running at the speed much faster than the tortoise, so that by the time he has reached the 500-meter mark, the tortoise has only walked 50 meters further than him. But by the time Achilles has reached the 550-meter mark, the tortoise has walked another 5 meters, and by the time he has reached the 555-meter mark, the tortoise has walked another 0.5 meters, then 0.25 meters, then 0.125 meters, and so on. This process continues again and again over an infinite series of smaller and smaller distances, with the tortoise always moving forward while Achilles always plays catch-up. Logically, this seems to prove that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise. Whenever he reaches somewhere the tortoise has been, he will always have some distance still left to go, no matter how small it might be. Except, of course, we know intuitively that he can overtake the tortoise. The trick here is not to think of Zeno's Achilles paradox in terms of distances and races, but rather as an example of how any finite value can always be divided an infinite number of times, no matter how small its divisions might come. Paradox number 3. The bootstrap paradox. The bootstrap paradox is another paradox of time travel that questions how something that is taken from the future and placed in the past could ever come into being in the first place. It's a common trope used by science fiction writers that has inspired plot lines in everything from Doctor Who to the Bill and Ted movies. But one of the most memorable and straightforward examples involves an author and his manuscript. Imagine that a time traveler buys a copy of Hamlet from a bookstore, travels back in time to Elizabethan London, and hands the book to Shakespeare, who then copies it and claims it as his own work. The centuries that follow Hamlet is reprinted and reproduced countless times until finally a copy of it ends up back in the same original bookstore, where the time traveler finds it, buys it, and takes it back to Shakespeare, who then wrote Hamlet. Paradox number 4, and one of my personal favorites, the ship of Theseus. Theseus was a mythical king and the hero of Athens. He did a lot of sailing, and his famed ship was eventually kept in an Athenian harbor as a sort of memorial museum piece. As time went on, the ship's wood began to rot in various places. Those wooden pieces were replaced one by one as time went on. More pieces needed replacing. The process of replacing rotten planks with new ones continued, at least in modern versions of the paradox, until the entire ship was made up of new pieces of wood. This thought experiment asks the question, is this completely refurbished vessel still the ship of Theseus? If we take it a step further and ask, what if someone else took all of the discarded original pieces of wood and reassembled them into a ship? Would this object be Theseus' ship? And if so, what do we make of the restored ship sitting in the harbor? Which is the original ship? This paradox is all about the nature of identity over time and has been subject of philosophical discussion for thousands of years. It appears in other forms, such as the question of the grandfather's axe and Trigger's broom, both of which ask whether an object remains the same after all the aggregate parts have been replaced. The idea even expands to question of personal identity. If a person changes drastically over time, so much that who they are no longer matches any part of who they once were, are they still the same person? Paradoxes 5 and 6. The Sorites paradox and the Horn paradox. Another paradox about the vague nature of identity is the Sorites paradox. The premise is fairly simple. It generally involves a heap of sand. If you take away a single grain of sand from the heap, it is still almost certainly a heap of sand. Now take away another grain, still a heap. If we continue this enough times, eventually it will be down to one grain of sand, which is almost certainly not a heap anymore. When did the sand cease being a heap and start being something else? The Sorites paradox is all about the vagueness of language, because the word heap does not have a specific quantity assigned to it. The nature of a heap is subjective. It also leads to false premises. For example, if you try the paradox in reverse, you start with a single grain of sand, which is not a heap. Then one could argue that one grain of sand plus another grain of sand is also not a heap. Then 2 grains of sand plus another grain of sand is also not a heap. This continues until even the statement, 1,000,000 grains of sand, is not a heap, as we know, does not make sense. The name of the paradox, Sorites, comes from the Greek word soros, which means heap or pile. It's often attributed to Euclides of Miletus. I might not be pronouncing that correctly. A logician from the 4th century BCE, who was basically a paradox machine. Most of his paradoxes deal with semantic fallacies, like the horn paradox. If we accept the idea that what you have not lost, you have, then consider the fact that you have not lost your horns. Therefore, you must have horns. And yes, most of his paradoxes are just as infuriating. Paradox number 7. One of Euclides of Miletus's more famous paradoxes, the liar paradox, is still discussed today. It has a very simple premise, but a very mind-boggling result. Here it is. This sentence is false. Think about it for a moment. If the sentence is true, then that means the sentence is in fact false, as it claims. But that would mean that the sentence is false. And if the sentence, "this sentence is false," then that means it's true. But if it's true, then it's false. You get the picture. It goes on and on forever. Paradox number 8. The Pinocchio paradox. The liar's paradox has been discussed and adapted many times, eventually leading to the Pinocchio paradox. It follows the same general structure, but with an added visual component. Imagine Pinocchio uttering the statement, "My nose grows longer now." If he's telling the truth, then his nose should grow longer, like he said. But as we know, Pinocchio's nose only grows if he is telling a lie, which means that if his nose did grow, then the statement would have been false. But if "my nose grows longer now" is false, then it should not have grown in the first place. This version of the paradox was created in 2001 by philosopher Peter Eldridge Smith's 11-year-old daughter. He summarized it neatly like this: Pinocchio's nose will grow if and only if it does not. Paradox number 9. The card paradox. Imagine you're holding a postcard in your hand, on one side of which is written, "The statement on the other side of this card is true." We'll call that statement A. Turn the card over, and the opposite side reads, "The statement on the other side of this card is false." Statement B. Trying to assign any truth to either statement A or B, however, leads to a paradox. If A is true, then B must be as well. But for B to be true, A has to be false. Oppositely, if A is false, then B must be false too, which must ultimately make A true. The card paradox is a simple variation of the liar paradox that was invented by the British logician Philip Jourdain in the early 1900s. Paradox number 10. The interesting number paradox. The interesting number paradox is debatably not a paradox at all, though is often called one. It basically goes to prove that all numbers are interesting, even the boring ones, which are actually interesting, of course, and not boring at all, because they're boring. Interesting, in this case, means it has something unique to it. For example, the number 1 is the first non-zero natural number. The number 2 is the smallest prime number. Number 3 is the first odd prime number. The list can go on and on until you reach the first uninteresting number. It does not have anything special or fascinating about it, but being the first uninteresting number you stumbled upon, it is, in fact, unique and therefore interesting. This process can be repeated indefinitely, hypothetically. This idea was born out of a discussion between the mathematicians Sirvansa Ramanujan and G.H. Hardy. Hardy remarked that the number on the taxicab he had recently written in 1729 was rather a dull one. Ramanujan responded that it actually was interesting, being the smallest number that is the sum of 2 cubes in 2 different ways. Paradox number 11. Newcomb's paradox. Imagine that you walk into a room where there are 2 boxes. You can see that the first box contains $1,000, but the second box is a mystery. Before you came into that room, an omniscient entity made a prediction about the choice that you will make. If it is predicted that you take only the second box, that box would contain $1 million. But if it predicted that you would take both boxes, the second box would be empty, and you'd walk away with $1,000 and 2 boxes. So what to do? One side argues to take only the second box. This is an omniscient entity doing the predicting after all. The other side would argue that the entity's decision has already been made. Nothing you do now in that room will have any effect on the dollar values in the boxes. So might as well take the gamble. And people can be surprisingly split on what to do. In 2016, a non-scientific online poll by The Guardian, which called the paradox one of philosophy's most continuous conundrums, found that 53.5% of people chose just the second box, and 46.5% of people chose both boxes. Paradox number 12. The dichotomy paradox. Imagine that you're about to set off a street. To reach the other end, you'd first have to walk halfway there. And then to walk halfway there, you'd first have to walk a quarter of the way there. And to walk a quarter of the way there, you'd first have to walk an eighth of the way there. And before that, a 16th of the way there. And then a 32nd and a 64th, and so on and so on. Ultimately, in order to perform even the simplest of tasks, like walking down a street, you would have to perform an infinite number of smaller tasks, something that, by definition, is utterly impossible. Not only that, but no matter how small the first part of this journey is said to be, it can always be halved to create another task. The only way in which it cannot be halved would be to consider the first part of the journey to be of absolutely no distance whatsoever. And in order to complete the task of moving no distance whatsoever, you can't even start your journey in the first place. This paradox is very similar to the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, dealing with smaller and smaller samples of distance and time infinitely. Paradox 13. The Raven Paradox. Also known as Hempel's Paradox, for the German logician who proposed it in the mid-1940s. The Raven Paradox begins with the apparently straightforward and entirely true statement that all ravens are black. This is matched by a logically contrapositive statement that everything that is not black is not a raven, which, despite seeming like a fairly unnecessary point to make, is also true, given that we know all ravens are black. Hempel argues that whenever we see a black raven, this provides evidence to support the first statement. But by extension, whenever we see anything that is not black, like an apple, this too must be taken as evidence of supporting the second statement. After all, an apple is not black, and nor is it a raven. The paradox here is that Hempel has apparently proven that seeing an apple provides us with evidence, no matter how unrelated it may seem, that ravens are black. It's the equivalent of saying that you live in New York is evidence that you don't live in LA, or that saying you are 30 years old is evidence that you are not 29. Just how much information can one statement actually imply anyway?